Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something a little bit different.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. So this was published back in 1895.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it's over a century old,
Right.
it's considered a foundational work in social psychology.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I thought this would be an interesting one to kind of deep dive into and see what we can learn.
Yeah, for sure.
And one thing that I thought would be interesting to look at with this in particular is that we had a listener write in.
Oh, cool.
And they were specifically asking about how this book can help us understand how elites in power might use crowd psychology
Oh,
to
interesting.
control populations and influence elections.
Oh, wow. That's a great question.
Yeah. So I thought that was a really interesting question. And I think that Le Bon's work offers some pretty intriguing insights into that.
Absolutely. Even though it was written so long ago, as you said, over a century ago, it can feel very relevant today.
Yeah, it really can.
Yeah.
So I guess to get started, can you give us kind of a quick overview of Le Bon's background? I have to admit, I'm not super familiar with him.
Sure. Yeah. So he was a French social psychologist, and he was writing at a time of major social and political upheaval.
Okay.
This was the aftermath of the French Revolution, the rise of industrialization, increasing social unrest.
Right.
And he was witnessing firsthand how crowds could be this force for both progress and destruction.
Oh, wow.
And that really shaped his thinking.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does he actually define a crowd? Is it just any group of people?
That's a great question. And not exactly. So Le Bon argues that a psychological crowd forms
Okay.
when individuals come together and a kind of collective mindset takes over.
Mhm.
Individual personalities diminish and a new entity kind of emerges. It's like
Right.
individual minds in a crowd become like cells in a body, creating something new
All right.
with its own unique traits.
Interesting analogy.
Yeah.
So if a crowd is like this single organism,
Mhm.
how does it think or behave differently than individuals?
Yeah, so Le Bon claims that in crowds, intelligence decreases
Okay.
and suggestibility increases. Emotions intensify, making people highly susceptible to influence, especially when it comes to shared instincts and unconscious desires.
Mm-hmm.
He suggests that even the smartest people, when part of a crowd, might not act with their usual level of logic or critical thinking.
That's kind of scary.
It is a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, if crowds are so easily influenced, it seems like they could be really easily manipulated,
Right.
especially by those who understand how this all works.
Exactly.
Is that where the idea of elites controlling the population comes in?
I think that's a big part of it, and Le Bon definitely provides some food for thought here.
Okay.
He argues that crowd behavior is driven more by these shared instincts and passions and unconscious forces than by individual intellect.
Okay.
He calls it this contagion of ideas.
Mhm.
Opinions spread like a virus through crowds, often with little logical basis.
So you're saying logic and reason kind of go out the window when you're caught up in a crowd.
Well, that's Le Bon's argument.
Okay.
And he illustrates this with kind of a striking example, the case of the wrongly identified drowned girls.
Okay.
So in this case, several witnesses insisted they'd seen this missing girl's body.
Mm-hmm.
Even a judge was convinced,
Wow.
but it turned out the girl was alive and, well, the body belonged to someone else entirely.
That's a powerful example
Right.
of how easily people can be misled when they're part of a crowd.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, how many times has something like this happened,
Yeah.
throughout history?
Absolutely. And if it can happen with something as straightforward as identifying a body,
Right.
imagine how much more susceptible we are to manipulation when it comes to complex political issues or during, a heated election.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So if those in power understand this crowd psychology,
Right.
how do they actually use it to control people
Yeah.
and influence things like elections?
Yeah. So Le Bon highlights the power of suggestion and the use of specific tools. Crowds aren't swayed by reasoned arguments, he says,
Okay.
but by vivid images, simple, powerful words, and catchy formulas.
So it's more about the feeling
Exactly.
than the actual logic.
Yeah, think of it as a politician using a powerful image
Right.
instead of explaining a complex policy.
Right.
Or consider how a slogan like infamous capital or the admirable working man
Right.
can stir up strong emotions and loyalties.
Yeah. So they appeal to emotions rather than logic.
Precisely. And Le Bon emphasizes how easily individuals in a crowd can be swayed by suggestion,
Okay.
and how this can be used to manipulate beliefs and actions,
Right.
even if those beliefs go against their own best interests.
That's pretty unsettling.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so how does this play out specifically in elections? Does Le Bon talk about that?
He does. He observed that a candidate's prestige, their perceived power and authority, often matters more to voters than actual talent or intellect. So, he explains why working-class voters, for example, might be drawn to a candidate who projects an image of success and power, even if that candidate doesn't represent their best interests.
Right. They're swayed by the image.
They're swayed by the image, exactly.
More than the actual policies or whatever. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about the speeches themselves? Like the speeches the candidates give?
Yeah, well, he also points out that the speeches that win elections aren't necessarily full of well-reasoned arguments or complex policy plans. Instead, Le Bon observed they tend to be filled with vague promises, powerful imagery. And those catchy slogans we were talking about.
Right, so repetition.
Repetition, exactly. He even uses the example of this vague but emotionally charged phrase that ignited the Spanish Revolution of 1873.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So, according to Le Bon, it's all about controlling the narrative.
Yeah.
Creating a compelling story that resonates with people's emotions.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Even if it doesn't hold up to logical scrutiny.
Yeah, that's a good summary of his argument.
Yeah.
He suggests that those in power can shape the stories we tell ourselves about the world.
Right.
Using those stories to maintain control.
It creates this illusion of choice.
Yeah.
Even in democratic societies.
Exactly.
Okay, this is getting a bit bleak. Are we just pawns in some grand game orchestrated by elites?
Well, it's definitely a thought-provoking perspective,
Yeah.
and one that challenges our assumptions about how power operates.
For sure.
Le Bon was skeptical about how much power individuals really have, especially when facing forces like crowd psychology that can be so effectively manipulated.
So what are we supposed to do? Just resign ourselves to being manipulated?
Well, not necessarily. Le Bon argues that understanding crowd psychology is the first step toward resisting manipulation.
Okay.
By recognizing the mechanisms at play, we can start to question the narratives being presented to us.
Okay.
And make more informed choices.
So knowledge is power.
In a way, yes. He believed that if we understand the inner workings of crowd behavior, we could potentially guide it in more constructive directions.
Okay.
Perhaps even counteract the manipulative tactics used by those who want to exploit crowds for their own gain.
So it can be used for good.
Exactly. He saw it as a way to move crowds towards progress rather than destruction.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So that's something we can look forward to in the next part of this deep dive.
Absolutely.
But before we go, can I ask you one more thing?
Yeah.
Le Bon seems pretty pessimistic about the limitations of institutions and education.
Right.
In truly changing the spirit of a people. Can you explain what he means by that?
Yeah, so he argues that even with the best institutions and widespread education, crowd psychology can still lead to poor choices and manipulation. He was particularly critical of what he called the classical type of education common in his day, claiming it didn't really help people develop better judgment or critical thinking skills.
So just memorizing facts and figures.
Exactly, rote memorization. Sometimes he even suggested it just made people more dissatisfied with their lot in life.
Oh, wow.
Making them even more susceptible to manipulation by those offering simple solutions to complex problems.
It sounds like he was concerned about the potential for elites to exploit this dissatisfaction.
Absolutely.
And use it to their advantage.
That's a very astute observation.
Okay.
And it's something we'll unpack further as we continue our exploration of Le Bon's ideas.
Well, this is fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
I can't wait to dig deeper.
Yeah, me too.
This is all so insightful, even if it is a little unsettling.
I agree. Le Bon's work can definitely challenge our assumptions.
Yeah.
But I think that's what makes it so valuable, especially in our current world.
Yeah, for sure. Well said. To all our listeners out there, make sure to join us for part 2, where we'll continue our deep dive into Le Bon's ideas and explore how they play out in our lives today.
Sounds good. Welcome back to our deep dive into Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd. You know, as we delve deeper into his work, it strikes me how much he emphasizes this cyclical nature of history.
Cyclical? What do you mean by that?
Well, he argues that civilizations rise and fall in these kind of predictable patterns.
Okay.
And that crowd psychology plays a big role in these cycles. He believed that societies go through these periods of stability and then upheaval.
Okay.
And crowds are often the driving force behind that change. Sometimes for good, sometimes not.
So where does he think we fit into all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. He believed that the late 19th century, his own era, was a time of transition and what he called anarchy.
Anarchy.
Yeah, he saw traditional beliefs declining and the power of the masses rising.
Given what we talked about in part 1 about how elites can manipulate crowds,
right,
I can see why he might be a little worried about a time when crowds have more influence.
Exactly. Le Bon was quite concerned about the destructive potential of crowds. Remember, he saw crowds as this force for both progress and regression. It's this double-edged sword idea.
Right, like crowds can be a powerful force for good, but they can also be easily manipulated and lead to chaos.
That's a good summary. He saw firsthand how quickly crowds could turn violent, how easily they were swayed by charismatic leaders.
Right.
And how often their actions had unintended negative consequences.
Yeah, it's fascinating and a bit frightening.
Yeah.
It makes his warnings about this era of crowds all the more relevant.
Right.
Especially in our modern world. I mean, think about the role of social media.
Oh, yeah.
It can spread information or misinformation
at
lightning speed. It feels like it just magnifies everything Le Bon was talking about.
You've hit on a key point here. Le Bon was writing long before the internet.
Right.
But many scholars believe his ideas are even more relevant today.
Okay.
Social media acts like this global megaphone for the contagion of ideas that he described. It's so easy for emotions to spread rapidly through online crowds, creating these huge waves of enthusiasm or outrage.
Yeah.
And it gives those in power even more tools to shape narratives and control the flow of information.
So if we're living in this era of crowds that Le Bon predicted,
right,
what does that mean for our future? Does he offer any solutions? Or are we just doomed to be manipulated?
Well, Le Bon wasn't exactly an optimist, but he did offer some thoughts on how to navigate this new world.
Okay.
He doesn't give easy answers, but he stresses that understanding crowd psychology is crucial.
Okay.
It's not just about protecting ourselves from manipulation, but also about potentially using this knowledge for good.
So knowledge is power.
In a way, yes. Le Bon believed that if we understand the inner workings of crowd behavior, we could potentially guide it in more constructive directions.
Okay.
Perhaps even counteract the manipulative tactics used by those who want to exploit crowds for their own gain.
Okay.
He saw it as a way to move crowds towards progress rather than destruction.
That sounds like a tall order, especially given how pessimistic he is about the intelligence of crowds.
Right.
Didn't he say that crowds aren't very good at making rational decisions?
He wasn't optimistic about the wisdom of crowds. That's true.
Okay.
But he didn't totally rule out the possibility of positive change.
Okay.
He saw a key role for strong leadership.
Okay.
And shaping crowd behavior.
Wait, I'm a little confused. Didn't he also say that the most effective leaders are often the ones who use those manipulative tactics we talked about? The ones driven by, what did he call it, stubborn convictions and narrowness of mind?
That's the paradox.
Yeah.
Le Bon saw both the potential and the danger of strong leadership.
Okay.
He recognized that it could be used for either good or bad.
It's like a double-edged sword.
Exactly. Powerful leaders can either manipulate crowds or inspire them.
So it all boils down to the intentions and ethics of the leader.
I think that's a key takeaway from Le Bon's work.
A leader who understands crowd psychology could either exploit that knowledge or use it to promote positive change.
It makes you think about all the leaders throughout history and wonder.
It really does.
Yeah. Le Bon would say, the key is for leaders to use their understanding of crowd psychology responsibly and ethically.
Easier said than done, though.
Right.
Right? Even with a responsible leader. How much choice do we really have in this era of crowds that Le Bon describes?
He was definitely concerned about that.
Yeah.
But he also believed that awareness is the first step toward having agency.
Okay.
By recognizing how crowd psychology works, we can at least start to question the narratives being presented to us.
Okay.
Even if they're coming from a seemingly well-intentioned leader.
So critical thinking is key.
Exactly. For Le Bon, it's about not taking things at face value, questioning assumptions, and looking for evidence to support or refute whatever claims are being made, even if they're coming from a powerful or charismatic figure.
It sounds like he's saying we need to be more discerning about the information we consume.
Yeah.
Especially in our age of information overload.
Absolutely. It's so easy to get swept up in a trending hashtag or a viral video without really thinking critically about what we're seeing.
Le Bon would probably agree.
He was already warning about the dangers of mass media and how it could be used to manipulate public opinion back in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
And now we have social media.
Right, which is like mass media on steroids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's more important than ever to develop these critical thinking skills.
So how do we cultivate this critical thinking? How do we avoid getting swept up in the crowd?
That's a great question, and it's one that Le Bon grapples with throughout his work.
Okay.
He placed a lot of emphasis on education, but not just any kind of education. He advocated for a type of education that goes beyond just memorizing facts.
Okay.
An education that teaches people how to think for themselves, question assumptions, and truly evaluate information.
So he sounds like a proponent of what we might call today a more holistic approach to education.
You're exactly right.
One that fosters not just intellectual, but social and emotional intelligence as well.
Absolutely. He saw these qualities as essential for navigating a world where the power of the crowd was on the rise.
Makes sense.
But even with better education, he recognized the ongoing challenge of individual agency in the face of these powerful collective forces.
This is so insightful. It's making me think about how Le Bon viewed the role of the individual in society.
Yeah.
Did he believe that individuals could truly make a difference?
Right.
Or are we really at the mercy of those collective forces?
That's a fantastic question, and it's one we'll delve into as we wrap up our deep dive into the crowd.
Well, listeners, you won't want to miss the conclusion of our deep dive, where we'll continue to explore Le Bon's ideas and consider how to apply them to our lives today. It's all about understanding crowd psychology and how it impacts us all. Welcome back to our deep dive into Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd. You know, it's fascinating how Le Bon contrasts the psychology of crowds with that of individuals. It makes you wonder which one is truly us.
Yeah, that's a great point. He definitely saw a distinction there. He argued that individuals are more capable of reasoned thought and deliberate action, while crowds often act impulsively and emotionally.
Okay.
He believed that when we become part of a crowd, we lose some of our individuality, some of our ability to think critically for ourselves.
But isn't that a bit of a generalization?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, surely not all crowds are irrational and impulsive.
Right.
Think about crowds that gather for a peaceful protest or to celebrate a historic event.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. Le Bon acknowledged that crowds can sometimes be heroic and selfless.
Okay.
He even cites historical examples like the Crusaders and the volunteers of the French Revolution.
Okay.
Crowds can be motivated by noble causes and inspiring ideals, no doubt.
So it's not as simple as saying crowds are always bad.
Exactly. But Le Bon maintains that even in these cases, even when crowds seem to be acting for the greater good, their behavior is often driven by unconscious forces, a kind of collective emotional energy. It's not always a conscious, rational decision-making process.
That makes sense. It's like we're all swept up in the energy of the moment,
right?
The shared emotions of the crowd. And maybe we don't always stop to think things through individually.
Yeah, Le Bon would say that's exactly what's happening.
Okay.
He argued that crowds are rarely guided by pure logic and reason. They're much more susceptible to emotional appeals, vivid imagery, powerful slogans, all those things we talked about earlier that elites can use to manipulate crowds for their own purposes.
Right. So what's the solution?
Mm-hmm.
If we can't rely on crowds to always make rational, well-thought-out decisions, how can we ensure that power is used responsibly, both by leaders and by the crowds themselves, especially in a democracy where public opinion matters so much?
That's the big question, isn't it? Le Bon believed that education was a key part of the solution.
Okay.
But not just any kind of education. He really pushed for an education system that emphasized critical thinking skills, one that taught individuals to question assumptions and evaluate information for themselves rather than blindly accepting what they hear from others.
So it's about empowering people to resist that pull of the crowds, that emotional contagion, and to think for themselves, regardless of what everyone else is doing or saying.
Exactly. He saw this as essential for the health of any society, especially in a world that's becoming more and more complex, where we're bombarded with information from all sides. We need to be able to sort through that information, figure out what's true and what's not, and make decisions based on evidence and reason, not just emotion.
It sounds like he's making an argument for media literacy as well.
Yeah.
Being able to analyze the messages we're being bombarded with, whether it's from politicians or advertisers, or even just our friends on social media.
You're right. That's a crucial part of it. Le Bon was already worried about the influence of mass media back in his day, and this was before radio or television even existed.
Right.
And now we have the internet and social media, which magnify those concerns exponentially.
It's almost like we're living in that world he predicted, the era of crowds.
Right.
But it's even more intense than he could have imagined. The power of crowds, the potential for manipulation, it's all amplified by technology and the speed at which information spreads.
He was sounding the alarm over a century ago, and it's even more relevant today. Le Bon reminds us that the power of crowds can be a force for good, but it's also a source of potential destruction. It's up to each of us to understand how it works and to guard against manipulation.
So what can we do? How do we cultivate those critical thinking skills, both for ourselves and for future generations? It feels like a daunting task.
It is daunting, but Le Bon's work gives us a starting point. He believed that understanding crowd psychology was the first step.
Okay.
By recognizing the mechanisms at play, we can start to see when we're being manipulated. We can question the narratives being presented to us. We can demand evidence and logic, not just emotional appeals.
That's a good reminder to question everything. Don't just take things at face value. Even if it's coming from a source you trust or a crowd you identify with, think for yourself.
That's what Le Bon would urge us to do. He saw critical thinking as the key to resisting the darker side of crowd psychology and harnessing its power for positive change. It's about becoming more conscious, more discerning, more engaged citizens.
That's a powerful message and one that feels particularly urgent in our current world. So to all our listeners out there, remember, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, think critically. Le Bon would thank you for it.
And so would we. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.